There's a story they tell in Cold Hollow, a small forgotten town nestled deep in the woods. It's the kind of story that isn't written down, only whispered from one person to another, late at night when the fires burned low. They call it the tale of the laughing man. No one remembers exactly when he first appeared. Some say it was back in the 1930s, when the Great Depression had hit the town hard. Cold Hollow was already isolated, but when the mills closed, it became a ghost town almost overnight. Desperate people turned to anything for entertainment or distraction. That's when the laughing man supposedly showed up. The stories say he was a clown, but not the kind you'd see at a circus or a birthday party. No, he didn't have balloons or silly tricks. He was tall and lean, his face painted in a grotesque grin that never seemed to match his cold, empty eyes. He wore a suit, ragged and threadbare, with colours that might have once been bright but were now dulled by time. And always he carried a single black balloon. The first people who saw him were children. They'd say he appeared just beyond the tree line, beckoning with a slow, deliberate wave. Sometimes he'd tilt his head as if to invite them to follow. Some kids swore they heard him laugh, low and breathy like he was choking on it. The ones brave enough, or foolish enough, to approach him were never seen again. Their parents would search the woods, but no trace was ever found. No footprints, no torn clothing, just silence. For years, the laughing man was little more than a local legend, a ghost story parents told to keep their kids from wandering too far into the forest. But then, in 1967, he came back, or maybe he'd never left. That year, 3 teenagers decided to test the legend. They were bored, restless, looking for something to do. One of them, Tommy Griggs, had a dare. Go into the woods at night, alone, and call out to the laughing man. The others stayed behind, waiting for him to return. He didn't. The next morning, they went looking for Tommy. At first they didn't find anything. Then, just as they were about to give up, they saw it. The black balloon, tied to the branch of a dead tree. Beneath it was Tommy's jacket, neatly folded, but there was no sign of Tommy himself. His parents reported him missing, but the sheriff didn't believe the kid's story about the laughing man. He said Tommy probably ran away, but everyone in Cold Hollow knew better. Over the years, more people disappeared. Not just kids either. Hunters, hikers, even a state trooper who'd come to investigate. The laughing man didn't discriminate. He was patient too. Some years, no one would see him at all and people would start to think he was just a myth. But then someone else would vanish and there'd be the balloon again, tied to a tree or floating above a patch of bare earth. In 1993, a local historian named Evelyn Brandt decided to dig into the town's past. She was fascinated by the legend and wanted to see if there was any truth to it. She went through old newspapers, diaries, anything she could find. What she uncovered was strange and chilling. There were mentions of a man matching the laughing man's description dating back to the 1800s, long before Cold Hollow was even founded. Travelers passing through the area wrote about seeing a peculiar figure standing by the side of the road holding a black balloon. Some described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were being watched even after they'd left him behind. Others reported nightmares that began after their encounter, dreams of laughter echoing through endless dark woods. Evelyn became obsessed, convinced that the laughing man was real. She started spending more and more time in the forest, trying to find him. One day she didn't come back. A search party found her notebook at the base of an old oak tree. Inside, the last page read, "He's here, he's smiling." Cold Hollow has fewer than 200 residents now. Most people who've stayed are too old or too stubborn to leave, but the legend persists. Every now and then, someone new hears about it and decides to investigate. They never find anything, at least not at first. But the ones who look too long, who go too deep into the woods, always seem to vanish. And for the rest of us, we stay away from the forest, especially at night. If you ever visit Cold Hollow and see a black balloon floating in the trees, do yourself a favor. Turn around and leave. Don't wait. Don't look for him. Because once you see the laughing man, it's already too late. There's a story my grandmother used to tell me, one she swore was true. It's about a clown. Not the kind you'd see at a circus, but the kind that finds its way into your life when you're most vulnerable. It begins with a man named Marcus Hale. He wasn't from our town. He moved in one autumn when I was a child. He bought the old Curtis house at the edge of town, a place no one wanted because of its history. People said it was cursed, though no one could agree on why. Some said it was because of the fire that took the Curtis family decades ago. Others said it was older than that, tied to something dark buried beneath the land. Marcus didn't seem to care about the stories. He was an artist, or so he told people, and he claimed the solitude of the house would help him focus. For the first few months, he kept to himself. Then, in the spring, people started noticing him around town. He always wore the same thing, a faded grey suit and a painted smile on his face. Not makeup, paint. Thick white paint smeared across his cheeks and lips in a grin that never quite reached his eyes. He said it was part of his art, a persona he'd created to explore human expression. At first, people thought he was eccentric but harmless. He'd sit in the park, sketching children playing, or old couples feeding the ducks. He'd offer candy to kids who wandered too close, and though some parents found it odd, no one complained. But then, people started noticing strange things. It was little at first. One boy swore he saw Marcus standing outside his bedroom window late at night, his painted smile glowing faintly in the dark. A woman claimed she heard laughter outside her house but saw no one when she looked. Another man, a farmer named Glenn, said he found footprints in his field, long, dragging tracks, like someone had been pulling something heavy behind them. And then there were the missing pets. Dogs, cats, even a few chickens. They'd vanish without a trace, except for the occasional streak of white paint on a fence post or a tree. People started whispering about Marcus, but no one confronted him. He was always polite, always smiling, and yet there was something about that smile that made your stomach twist, like you were looking at something that wasn't quite human. The first person to go missing was a girl named Annie. She was 12, last seen riding her bike near the Curtis house. When she didn't come home for dinner, her parents called the sheriff. They searched for days, combing the woods and dragging the river, but found nothing. A week later, her bike turned up in Marcus's yard. It was leaning against the side of the house, the handlebars bent and the seat torn. But Marcus wasn't there. The sheriff broke down the door, but the house was empty. Inside, they found dozens of paintings, all of them unfinished, and in every single one, there was a clown. Sometimes he was in the background, hidden among the trees or the shadows of a room. Other times he was front and center, his painted smile stretching too wide, his eyes too dark. And in one painting, unmistakably, was Annie. She was sitting on a swing, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Behind her, the clown was pushing her, his hands just visible on the ropes. The sheriff ordered the house boarded up, but people say it didn't help. Some nights, they say, you can still see Marcus wandering the streets. His grey suit is torn now, his painted smile cracked and flaking. He doesn't talk anymore, he just watches. And sometimes, if you're alone and unlucky, he'll follow you home. People in our town don't go out after dark anymore. We keep our doors locked and our curtains drawn. And if you ever hear laughter in the night, soft, breathy laughter that doesn't quite sound right, don't look outside. Because once you see him, he won't stop smiling, and he won't stop following. There's a story that's been whispered in my family for years, passed down from my grandfather. He swore it happened to him when he was a boy, and though he was never the kind to scare us for fun, he always grew pale when he spoke of it. He called it the birthday clown. It was 1948, and my grandfather, James, was turning 8. His family wasn't well off, but they did what they could to make the day special. His mother baked a small cake, his father rigged up streamers in their tiny living room, and a few friends came over to celebrate. It was simple, but James was happy. The trouble began when a knock came at the door. James's mother answered, expecting it to be one of the neighbors. Instead, there stood a clown. He was tall, wearing a faded red and yellow suit with oversized shoes and a hat tilted slightly to the side. His face was painted stark white, with a red, toothy grin that stretched far too wide. "Happy birthday to you," the clown sang in a low, rasping voice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a balloon, black, not the cheery kind of color you'd expect, and twisted it into a misshapen animal James couldn't recognize. He handed it to James without a word. James's parents looked at each other in confusion. They hadn't hired a clown, and none of the neighbors had mentioned anything about one. But they were polite folks and didn't want to cause a scene, so they let the clown in. The clown didn't talk much. He just stood in the corner, smiling at everyone, his eyes following James wherever he went. The kids played games, ate cake, and tried to ignore him, but his presence filled the room like a shadow. Every so often he'd make another balloon animal, each one stranger than the last. A twisted bird with too many wings, a dog with no head, a figure that looked almost human, but bent in impossible ways. When the party was over, the clown lingered. James's mother gently asked if he needed help finding his way back, but the clown just tilted his head and let out a low chuckle. Then he walked over to James, knelt down so their eyes were level, and said, "See you soon." That night, James couldn't sleep. The clown's painted face was burned into his mind, and every time he closed his eyes, he swore he heard the faint squeak of balloons twisting in the dark. A week passed, life returned to normal, and James started to convince himself it had just been an odd encounter, nothing more. But then he started seeing the clown. It began with fleeting glimpses, a figure in the distance as he walked to school, a face in the window of the candy store, always the same toothy grin, always watching. James told his parents, but they dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination. Then the noises started. At night, James would hear faint giggles outside his window, sometimes the sound of balloons twisting and squealing. One night he gathered the courage to look outside, and there he was, standing under the street lamp, holding one of those strange balloon animals. The next morning, James found it on his front porch. It was twisted into the shape of a child, lying on its back with its hands folded over its chest, like it was in a coffin. Terrified, James's parents contacted the police, but there was nothing they could do. The clown had vanished, leaving no trace behind. For years, James tried to forget about it. He grew up, moved away, started a family of his own. But on his 30th birthday, a package arrived at his door. Inside was a single black balloon and a note that read, "Happy birthday, see you soon." James never spoke about what happened after that. He became withdrawn, paranoid, always checking the locks on the doors and windows. He'd jump at the sound of laughter, no matter how innocent. When he passed away, we found something odd among his belongings. Tucked in the back of his closet was a small, twisted balloon animal, a child lying on its back, hands folded over its chest.